Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third and final installment of Primary Sources webinar series, Politics and Cultures in the Middle East Today. I'm Dan Osborne, a program director here at Primary Source. It's my pleasure to be joined by all of you as we conclude this exploration into the modern Middle East, having already examined geopolitical and religious topics that can help offer more global approaches to social studies education while fostering our students' sense of belonging to global communities. For those of you who may be new to Primary Source, we're a Massachusetts-based nonprofit committed to promoting global learning in K-12 classrooms. We work with teachers to foster students' skills, knowledge, and dispositions for responsible and engaged citizenship through professional development and curricular resources. We use multicultural and culturally relevant approaches to nurture students' civic mindedness in an increasingly diverse and interconnected world. To learn more about our work and our upcoming online course offerings, visit www.primarysource.org. Among our other resources, you'll be able to access our archive of past webinars on a range of topics that can be of service to bringing the world into your classroom. Tonight, we conclude our Middle East series, shifting our focus towards a more explicitly cultural conversation. We'll move away from thinking about nation states and international relations. Instead, we'll focus on youth cultures and the manifold ways young people express themselves, form communities, and respond to, but also shape, local and global trends in art and society. The way young people spend their leisure time and interact with the world around them can be quite revealing about economic realities, educational opportunities, political tensions, and religious identities. Discussing youth culture can be lighthearted and fun, but also another way of approaching and discerning insights into more profound questions around opportunities, frustrations, and even aspirations. At Primary Source, we're committed to making the study of global diversity relevant and meaningful in the lives of students in US classrooms. Focusing tonight's conversation on young people throughout the Middle East is one particularly appealing way to accomplish this. As our own students grapple with questions of individuality and explore ways to have fun and navigate their social and cultural worlds, so do youth throughout the Middle East. Music, art, and entertainment are ways to build bridges between students in our classrooms and their counterparts across the globe. For this reason, we'd hope that this webinar continues in the trend of humanizing, demystifying, and illuminating the vitality and complexity of people's identities throughout the Middle East. We hope this webinar promotes a more inclusive vision of the Middle East and addresses some of the absences and silences that too often obscure accurate and nuanced understandings of the region's plurality. We're joined by Youssef Chazli, a junior research fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. Youssef was previously a postdoctoral researcher at the French National Center for Scientific Research, where he worked on a transnational archive of protest movements in the Arab Mediterranean. His dissertation, Becoming a Revolutionary in Alexandria, examines the emergence and development of a protest arena during the 2000s, prior to the 2011 revolution. Before we transition to the presentation, I'd like to invite and encourage everybody to type questions in the chat box. I'll be monitoring this and bringing them to Youssef's attention towards the end of his presentation. For participants in this series interested in earning professional development points, I'd like to remind you that you're eligible to earn a total of 10 PDPs for joining us for each of the 3 installments in the series. In order to earn PDPs, we ask that you respond to the reflection prompt that will be sent out via email after tonight's webinar, within 2 weeks of tonight's live broad stream. As we listen to tonight's presentation, let's keep in mind the following questions. What about economic, political, and religious conditions can help us inform our understanding of youth cultural expressions. What misunderstandings about the Middle East could addressing youth cultures in classrooms dispel? For those of you who are teaching, what would your learning objectives be for including the study of youth cultures in your coursework dedicated to the study of the Middle East? Again, we'll be sending these questions out via email after tonight's webinar. But for now, it's my pleasure to begin tonight's presentation and introduce Dr. Chazli. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. I'm really happy to be participating in that webinar series with Primary Source. I obviously would have loved to participate in such an event in person, be able to have a more interactive discussion with everyone, but unfortunately, these are the conditions in which we are right now. And on that note, I really hope that everyone listening in today is doing well and that they and their loved ones are being safe. Obviously we're here dealing with a huge topic, right? Let's not kid ourselves. If we look just at the title that was given, youth, culture, politics, and the Middle East, already these four words would kind of open for a huge discussion. To give you an example, a couple of years back, taught a 25-hour-long course that was entitled Being Young in Egypt. So you can imagine all the things that would need to be unpacked to look at the youth, the culture, and the politics in the Middle East. So obviously, it is a way in such a short format. We have to kind of have a packed version of that. We have to cram a lot in it. But please make sure to, via Dan, send questions, and I'll do my best to respond during the Q&A. So before starting, I want to kind of have a general kind of spell out how this webinar is going to go. And this is not an outline per se I'm going to present, but rather a couple of general ideas that I am going to weave through this presentation. So in a sense, these are kind of 5 points I would like you to keep in mind and maybe take out of that webinar because they are going to keep coming back all throughout for the next 55 minutes or so. The first point that I'd like you to keep in mind is that when we're talking about the use of the Middle East and North Africa, so what I'll be referring to as the MENA region in this webinar, we're talking about approximately 115 million people, right? We're talking about several languages and dialects, several religions and several religious denominations. We're talking about a variety of lifestyles, political and economic contexts. So even within one country, it is very hard to put a single group under what would be the youth. So I think it's important to kind of remind ourselves of that expression by a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, when he says that youth is only a word, right? And by that, he was trying to highlight the fact that there is little in common in the experience, in the everyday experience of a wealthy young woman from the affluent neighborhoods of Beirut in Lebanon, and I don't know, for instance, a working young man from the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. So when thinking, and it is an important point that we talk a lot about youth, although youth represents such a variable population, it is an important aspect of how we think about the Middle East. And that is, as we will see, and this is the second point, that youth constitute the largest group in the population in most of these countries. So that is a phenomenon that is known as the youth bulge, and I will talk a bit more about that later on. But usually youth bulges happen in developing countries, and they can entail several economic and social difficulties. Youth can find themselves excluded from economic and political life, and this is always an important backdrop when to have in mind when we think about the conditions of youth in any region of the world, but in very more specifically in the MENA region. The third point I'd like you to keep in mind is that for decades, really, youth were an object of study, were an object of concern, and were an object of public policy. So what do I mean by that? Is that a lot of stakeholders, a lot of social actors, social scientists like myself, psychologists, but even moralists and religious authorities kind of look at the youth, try to understand youth, try to have the problems of youth as a concern. And obviously political authorities have kind of look at youth with both a sense of hope and fear at the same time, and we'll look more into that. But this is important to think that a lot of groups, several groups with different interests, look at youth and construct youth as a category of thought, as a category of public action. And we need to look behind all that and try to understand what happens when we do that. And we'll see that the way that youth is perceived in that region changed drastically around the year 2011, and that stayed for a few years, but has now kind of changed back, and we'll see how. The fourth point I'd like you to keep in mind is that despite all of that, much like everywhere else, probably, youth of the Middle East and North Africa, they have hopes and dreams. They want to live good lives, or at least normal lives when they can't lead good lives, and they strive through many ways to do that. They try to give meaning to their lives, and they do so via different pursuits and projects, from small pastimes and leisure to grand schemes such as getting married or migrating to another country. And this is something that is very kind of structuring of their perceptions of the world. And it is important to keep in mind. And a last point that will kind of actually occupy the second half of the webinar and will be more on the topic of culture, and as it is stated in the title of that webinar, is that looking at certain areas where culture and politics intersect can be quite helpful in understanding how youth give meaning to their lives, right? They try to create new spaces, other spaces, spaces where they can escape the kind of regular pace of life and the, let's call it, rationale of capital and of success. They try to unmake the system and subvert the rule, and they try to be together in fun and unproductive ways. And that usually tends to be a source of at least government scrutiny, but most of the time repression. So these are kind of five broad topics that are going to come back and forth during this presentation, and it's interesting to keep them in mind. So let's get into it, right? Let's get into the issue of why are we looking at youth? Why is that webinar focused on youth? There has been, as I mentioned, a long-standing interest in youth, and that interest has been from a variety of stakeholders and actors. Let's start with a very interesting and relatively recent report that was done by the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, in 2010. And it was a report that was focusing on youth in Egypt. Oh, and maybe here just a quick caveat I forgot to mention at the end of my introduction, is that in that presentation, I will be focusing mostly on Egypt. I will be referring to other countries of the region, but I will mostly focus on Egypt for three reasons. The first reason is that Egypt is the most populous country of the Middle East and North Africa. So it's almost a country of 100 million. It is more than 100 million people now. 1 in every 4 Arabs are from Egypt, probably very soon 1 in 3 Arabs are from Egypt. The second reason is that Egypt has been kind of a prototypical example of for the rest of the Arab world. It has been that kind of a prototype. A lot of countries have been influenced by Egypt or have followed the way Egypt has dealt with especially its youth problem. And the third and probably the most important reason when it comes to a social scientist talking about a topic is that it is the case I've studied the most for the past decade. So that caveat out of the way, let's get back to that report from the UNDP. So that report was talking about Egyptian youth, and it was painting a rather grim image. kind of outlined all the economic constraints and all the problems. And politically, it was saying that, youth in Egypt are apathetic, they're depoliticized, they don't care that much about politics, and this does not bode well for the future. And interestingly enough, a few months after the publication of that report, what happened in Egypt and elsewhere around the region? Well, as you know, what has been called the Arab Spring or the Arab Revolutions started happening in December 2010 in Tunisia, and then from January onwards in other countries, and Egypt was among them. And when you look at that cover from Time magazine, you see a different image, and you see several Egyptian young activists on it, and it says the generation changing the world. So suddenly, the Arab Spring kind of changed that vision of youth who were uninterested in politics, who weren't concerned with their country, and suddenly the revolution became the event that brought the youth forward. And why is that the case? Why did the Arab Revolution, put youth in such kind of the forefront of the event, and you had all that focus on them? Well, first of all, youth were the spokespeople of the revolution in a sense. If you look at this example here, for instance, and this is the 100 list of Time magazine in 2011, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that list. And here it is talking about Wa'il Ghunim, who is presented as the spokesman for a revolution. And the first sentence tells us that Wa'il Ghunim embodies the youth who constitute the majority of Egyptian society. Ghunim was a marketing executive at Google Middle East, and he had created a Facebook page which helped play a notable role in mobilizing people in Egypt. So that was one of the spokespeople, or at least one of the visible icons at some point early on in the Egyptian revolution. But also in other countries that were going through transformation, you had similar spokespeople or figures. In Yemen, for instance, you had someone like Tawakkul Karman, who went up to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. And that Yemeni journalist and human rights activist became also a figure of the Yemeni uprising. So you have, I'm not gonna show more of these examples, but you have several examples that kind of show these spokespeople. You also had artists who were considered as, or at least in a Western perception, since I am here citing Time magazine and Western sources, you had artists such as El General, a Tunisian rapper, who here, as you can see, is considered as credited with helping inspire the uprising in his country that overthrew President Zain al-Abidin bin Ali. So you have these figures, political activists, bloggers, people who are active online, journalists, human rights activists, who kind of appeared as figures and spokespeople for the revolution, and they shared the fact that they were young. But youth were also figures and symbols, sometimes unintentionally, like in the cases of some youth whose death acted as triggers of upheavals. The most probably famous one was the case of Mohamed Bouazizi, a fruits vendor in Tunisia, who set himself on fire to protest an unfair treatment in December 17, 2010. And his act of self-immolation and later on his death a few days later is widely considered as, if I may say so, the spark that lit the revolutionary fire in Tunisia. And then in Egypt, you had a similar case, or at least a comparable case, that of Khaled Said, who was a young Alexandrian man who was beaten to death by two policemen in my hometown of Alexandria, Egypt. And his death kind of initiated a wave of protest against police brutality. It led to the creation of a Facebook page which attracted tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people. And it was this page, the We Are All Khaled Said page, that called for protest in January 25, which became the first day of the Egyptian revolution. And who had created that Facebook page? Well, it was that Wa'il Ghunim, the young Google executive that I had just mentioned. So youth became symbols, and more generally, why they were kind of the figure, the main actors of the revolutionary upheavals. So it kind of makes sense that we had a large focus on them afterwards. But in a sense, is it that strange that youth were kind of the main actors of revolutions? And here I'm not kind of going back to old theories of the juvenile disposition to protest, and you had a lot of that in the late 19th century and early 20th century, all of these psychological theories that kind of equated youthfulness with irrationality and thus protest. No, it is for kind of a simpler fact that it is, which is quite important, and I want us to stop for a couple of minutes on that graph. So this is a compilation I created based on data from the CIA World Factbook, so not necessarily the best source of information, but it came in handy in this case. And what you see on that graph here is the median age for the Middle East and North Africa. And as I'm sure all of you know, the median age is basically the age that divides a population into two numerically equally sized groups. So basically, half of the people in a given country are younger than this age, and half are older. So it's basically an index that summarizes the age distribution of a population. It is a good indicator to know if a population is young or old. And here, I think it's not very complicated to see that the Arab world and Middle East region is an extremely young region. If you look here, this is the limit I put here. The oldest median age in the Middle East and North Africa is for the United Arab Emirates, and it goes up to 38.4 years old. Well, even that is still younger than the youngest of other countries, which is the US, its median age is 38.5. So very quickly, you can see that the average median age is here 26.8, almost 27 years old, whereas the median age for Europe, for instance, is 43.1. If we take the extremes, the Gaza Strip in Palestine is 18 years old, whereas Germany is almost 48 years old. So this is a difference of 30 years almost in the median age. And this probably tells you why there is a keen interest of countries like Germany in getting in refugees, especially skilled refugees that might help occupy many of the sectors needed in jobs in Germany. So obviously it is a very young population, the Arab world and the Middle East. It is the second youngest population in the world after sub-Saharan Africa. So that kind of also tells you why there must be an interest in youth. These are young countries, right? And that brings us to the issue of the youth bulge. So as you can see here in that figure here, that 27% of the region's population is made of adolescents and youth, young adults, and it is 24% in the case of the world's population. So it is here a higher rate. But as we mentioned, Arab region, Middle East, is endowed with around 115 million adolescents and youth, which make most of these countries face a youth bulge, which is a common phenomenon in many developing countries. Basically, a youth bulge happens when you have, in the same time, a trend of reducing infant mortality that coexists with high fertility rates. So less infants die at birth and still have a quite high fertility rate. The demographical transition hasn't happened yet. So that gives you, as a result, a very large share of the population comprised of children and young adults. If you look at the case of Egypt, for instance, in the 2000s, Egypt was younger than it had ever been and probably than it will ever be. And youth were the biggest share of the population. In the year 2006, the under 30 years old constituted 61% of the population. That's a huge share. That's a huge number. And next year, the following year, in 2007, it was estimated that 28% of the Egyptian population was between 15 and 29 years old. So obviously this situation can lead to several economic and social difficulties, right? Especially in developing countries. With that number of youth, you have to, every year, a bigger part of youth are coming, getting enrolled in universities, getting diplomas, arriving on the job market, and this is happening in the same time in context of economic crises where you have less jobs and you have a more and more precarious situation. So you can see the conundrum here. And this conundrum has produced something that authors have called the Arab youth paradigm, which is in a lot of studies, especially after the Arab Spring, because a lot of people saw the Arab Spring as a consequence of that situation. Because there was a youth bulge, because there was marginalization, because there was poverty, youth revolted. So that produced something that is called the Arab youth paradigm, which is basically to reduce all the problems in the Middle East to a very simple equation, that is, problems in the Middle East equal youth bulge plus marginalization and exclusion. So basically, if you create programs that can help resolve that tension between the youth bulge and the marginalization and exclusion, then you solve the problems in the Middle East. So I'm not going to get into the detail of the critique of that paradigm, which is very interesting, and there is a reference that is put here, and I can provide it afterwards. But suffice to say that there has been a general critique of that tendency to see the problems from above and kind of try to all make it hold in economic terms and saying, you know, well, if people had less kids and if you solve the marginalization, then you don't have any more problems. So it kind of makes it helps obfuscate other problems and divides racial, class, gender divides that are not visible when you look at it just in that kind of generational point of view or pattern. And this kind of leads us to a next big problem, which is youth as objects, right? So throughout different phases of political history in the region, youth were an object of study, concern, and public policy, as I mentioned in the introduction. Social scientists, psychologists, moralists, religious authorities, but also, of course, political authorities looked at the youth both with a sense of hope and fear. Youth were seen as a problem, as something to deal with, as something to contain. And the evolution of this perception followed different waves of unrests over the decades. And when you look at kind of historical documentation and works such as the studies conducted by Umniya Shakri, a historian, you see that this is kind of an old phenomenon, an old pattern. As early as the 1930s, you had texts written on youth as peril and promise and how to deal with the raw energy of youth. So obviously, first of all, youth kind of always appeared as a political threat, as students, as protesters, and then in the 70s and 80s as the image of the Islamist activist. But they also, especially from the 90s onwards, began to be constructed as social threats. And that construction of youth as a social threat, as a source of, as a menace, really took place in a context of economic crisis and rising precarity. So the context is, while the country was, so I'm here speaking about Egypt, obviously, but this can be applicable to quite many countries of the region. While the country was getting younger and younger, reaching its peak of youthfulness in the mid-2000s, as we saw, there was a process of aggressive economic liberalization, which had started a decade earlier, and that was done on the recommendations of international financial institutions, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So wages were dwindling down, costs were going up, and more youth were arriving on the job market, couldn't get jobs. If they couldn't get jobs, then they couldn't fulfill what we call the adulthood checklist in the literature, in the anthropological and sociological literature. And the adulthood checklist means getting a job, saving up, being able to buy an apartment, get married, and start a family. So, in other words, transition from a child to a an adult. And a lot of youth found themselves stranded in an in-between stage that was the source of all problems, right? A lot of people believed, and a lot of analysts, and a lot also in the political authorities, believed that that was what produced Islamism or protest or even drug use or even Satanism or even thuggery. And you kind of have here images, but I'm not going to get into their detail now. We can go back to them because I see the time flying by. Um, but kind of that became the basis of thinking about the crisis in many of these countries. How do you reconcile that being stranded in that in-between stage, not being an adult, and how do you fill out that time? How do you reclaim your agency? How do you find a solution for your problems in that very specific and constraining context? And more precisely, this kind of evolved around a nexus, around a kind of a general discourse that was very prominent in the 90s and 2000s when I remember, which I remember quite well as I was growing up, that kind of pitted one in front of another, two figures, right? In a context of general youth unemployment rate, which you can see is the highest worldwide in the Arab world and the Middle East in general, you had two figure. Uh, you had two figure constructed around that nexus of unemployment, idleness on one hand, and success in personal lives on the other hand. And the opposition was between two figures. On the one hand, you had the entrepreneur. So you had that creative young man who pulls himself by the bootstraps and who doesn't await anything from the state because he finds solution for himself. And kind of the role model for that figure was that man, Gamal Mubarak. Gamal Mubarak is the younger son of late former President Hosni Mubarak, who was in power from 1981 to 2011 when he was forced to step down under the pressure of the Egyptian revolution. And he was a private university, educated in a private university, the American University in Cairo, had studied business, had worked at the Bank of America, and had come back to Egypt in the 1990s and was kind of leading the effort to privatize the economy and kind of, change the model of economic development in the country and push it for a more kind of a businessman, entrepreneurial spirit rather than a social welfare system. And on the other hand, in front of that entrepreneur, of that young dynamic entrepreneur figure, you had the unemployed graduate, which is a central figure of the 90s and 2000 politics in many countries, not only Egypt, but also the North African countries of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and many other places. And the unemployed graduate was basically the kind of young living in the past, kind of waiting for the state to do everything for him and not kind of engaging and pushing themselves to do something and to find solutions and so on. And I'm choosing that image to illustrate it, that figure from an Egyptian movie which came out in the year 2000, which I think is a great example of that kind of a great example of how these problems looked in real life in the 2000s. It's a comedic movie, and the movie portrays a group of young, frustrated, unemployed college graduates trying to kill time. And the main narrative thread of that movie, which is called Film Thaqafi, so the title is A Cultural Movie. The main narrative of the movie follows them in their adventures. And we see that group of young, frustrated men who are unable to find jobs, or those who work don't have enough money to get married, and that makes them sexually frustrated. And the whole movie is basically about them getting hold of a porno movie on a VHS early on in the film, and trying to find a compatible VHS player to watch it. And obviously, it is a moralistic comedy that kind of is criticizing how youth, the idleness of youth, kind of lead them to engage in deviant activities such as watching pornography. But on the other hand, it is also a very strong critique of the economic system that has brought them in that situation. And if only they could have jobs, if only they were able to not be in that precarity, they would be able to get married. They wouldn't be frustrated, and apparently wouldn't be watching pornography. So this kind of is a good example to see how all of these topics were brought together. And I want to just kind of show that these indicators, and I'm not going to dwell a lot on them, but it kind of gives you a more top-down image, a broader image of what I was saying from a specific point of view. When you look at the Youth Development Index, which is a composite index of 18 indicators that measure progress on youth development, right? So basically, they measure levels of education, health, well-being, employment, political participation, and so on. And it kind of gives you this indicator, this number that is supposed to see how the youth development is going in given countries. And obviously, if you look at it, if you look at these indicators, well, the MENA region does not fare very well, with the exception of the oil-rich countries, which are able, through that kind of massive influx of money, to offset the problems that other countries see in the region. And yeah, obviously here, most of them are very badly ranked, and it does not seem as a good situation for youth development. But let's not dwell on that, because I want to get now to the second half of that webinar. I'm going to drink some water. I wanted to use the webcam, but unfortunately it hasn't been working. So I think it's always a bit strange to listen to all that talking from someone, and it's strange for me. I feel like I'm talking on my own. But I want to get now to the second half of that of the webinar, and the second half, in a sense, wants to flip that presentation on its head, kind of look at it the other way. I have been engaging in the first half of the webinar in most of what I was describing, in the sense that, as I said, people categorize youth, look at youth from above, trying to understand the problems of youth, the structural constraints and obstacles that youth face. But in that discussion, youth are kind of absent. We do not understand how they go about, how they feel. Do they want to do that? Do they want to engage to find jobs? Do they want to, what do they want to, basically? How do they perceive their place in the world? How do they think about it? How do they go about changing it? And in the last years, I mean, in the last decades also, anthropology and sociology has been doing a lot of good research to kind of get into the worlds of the youth and try to understand their point of view instead of just looking at kind of a from above conceptualization of what they should want or what we believe they want. And this brings me to the point of the good life. And here I want to mention the work. I mean, I could have quoted a lot of people, obviously, but I think on Egypt, at least, the work of an anthropologist from Finland, Samuli Shika, has been particularly interesting in kind of looking at how youth think about their lives and try to find their places in the world. As I mentioned in the introduction, much like everywhere else, the youth in the Middle East and North Africa, they have hopes and dreams. They want to live and lead good lives, or at least when that becomes hard, normal lives, and they strive to do that in very different ways. And basically, it kind of goes down to an issue of how to have control on one's life, right? In a context where you feel that everything is bigger than you, that you have these big authoritarian governments, or even if not authoritarian, you have these big economic processes that kind of are over your head. And how can one have any kind of power on one's own life in that context? And this is that existential problem is very visible in the works of someone like Samuli Shilke, because you see how it is a kind of a very central aspect of how youth think about their lives and their places in the world, how to reclaim a sense of agency. And then when you're stranded in that in between, how to kill time, how to make time pass when you are kind of stranded in these very dull moments that can be the life of a youth without money, or in an authoritarian setting, and so on. And we could say a lot of things about them. We could talk about religiousness as a very interesting way of sense making and sense constructing, how engaging in ethical self-cultivation, or in different forms of religiousness, or we can think of even political activism, and even sometimes kind of radical political activism, violent activism, some of the things that might seem violent or irrational as far as jihadism and so on. How does that relate to experiences of feeling alienated and angry, and also kind of lost and bored? And we'll get to that at the end, at the very end, at the conclusion. And we could obviously talk about political activism, which is most of what I've worked on, whether leftist or liberal or Islamist. But I want to leave all that aside, because all of that has been well documented as kind of a more classical way to look at the problem. And I want to kind of focus on you on that quote. And this is when I was writing my dissertation, which was on the Egyptian Revolution, as Dan mentioned. I was reading this very interesting book by an Argentine a historian and musicologist named Esteban Buch, who, you have a version in French and in Spanish of that book. And he had been a young musician, a young man in Argentina in the 1970s and 80s under the dictatorship. And he was reflecting in that very interesting book about his experience as a young man in a provincial city of Argentina. And when I was reading the book, it kind of struck me how similar it was to things I had seen in Egypt, and even in Tunisia, Morocco, and other countries I had visited. So Buch says, when thinking about it today, he's reflecting about his past experience. I don't think I was resisting by the mere fact of singing and jumping around like crazy while listening to songs of a band he used to like during that night of July 1980. However, I think that I found a space there, which in a hostile or at least sterile environment allowed me to appreciate the fact of not being alone, of speaking with others. And I think this is a really central thing to think about when looking at youth experiences in these countries, is the issue of spaces, or as French philosopher Michel Foucault would say, other spaces. Spaces when one can be different, where one can try different things than the institutionalized spaces that already exist, such as, I don't know, the mosque, the university, the family house, and all of that. And when you look in kind of the recent history, you see that the decade of the 2000s was one of relative opening in many of the countries of the region. There was some leniency in cultural activities, which created many spaces for youth, but which also obviously did not go without its forms of control and repression. But there was a form of opening in these times. If the university or the mosque, for instance, had played such an important role for a long time in bringing people together, it was because they were some of the only socialization and being together spaces at that time. Even by the 90s, the kind of leisure places where you could go were very divided by class. They were very segregated, or by religious affiliation. The 2000s were kind of different. You had many important spaces that started emerging. And I want to look at a couple of these in that presentation. So obviously, if we had a kind of a back and forth interaction, I would have asked you, what do you imagine was the most important space that arrived in the 2000s in the Arab region and in Egypt? You probably would have said the internet, and that is correct. So you were right. It is the internet, and the internet, it's really its democratization in the 2000s and later on has played a tremendous role. And there are a lot of debates on, how does the internet really affect the political life? Does it really change? Did it really cause the revolutions? I think these are kind of moot points. They're not that interesting as debates, but anyone who studies that region of the world, and any region, I would imagine, cannot, discard the importance of internet as a space for doing multiple things and for very different categories of people. Chat rooms, downloading clips and songs and movies, learning instruments of music, all the DIY culture, the do-it-yourself culture, that was central and brought a lot to the youth in that region. Whereas before, you needed to you would hang out or you would interact with people from your social class or from your religious group or from just logically your geographical the places where you lived or where you went to. It became possible to meet a variety of people and chat with a variety of people and kind of open up to different things very easily. And until today, the internet is really maybe one of the rare remaining spaces where people in general, but youth in particular, express themselves and kind of subvert the rules and make fun of them. I put a very one of the examples, but really there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples. Which is called it's a Sarcasm Society. It's a page on Facebook which has more than 15 million followers, and on that type of pages, not a day goes by in the region where any political event, any sporting event, any power figure isn't satirized almost immediately. Almost immediately, we'll have hundreds maybe of memes and of jokes on any event or any figure. So in a sense, the internet has brought forth a lot of taboos and a lot of discussions that were hitherto difficult to have. And this is really from also a personal experience as someone who has kind of followed that internet use as an adolescent and as a young man. I think the experience of that is very different from even people who grew up maybe 5 or 10 years before me and did not have that very strong connection with the internet. But there are other kind of spaces that we can think of, and for instance, the shopping malls. As I mentioned, in the 1990s and 2000s, you have kind of an aggressive economic liberalization agenda that goes on. The internet is opened in a sense in relation to that liberalization of the economy, but you also have a multiplication of shopping malls, copying the US model. And if you look here at this statistic from a PhD dissertation by Marika Snyder, who has worked on malls in Egypt, you see that from the 1990s onward, and especially in the 2000s, you have a huge amount of malls being built and being constructed and opening up for people. And the interesting thing about malls is that although malls are by definitions temples of consumption and really are made to for people to come and consume, buy things, and spend their money, Marika Snyder, in her PhD, in her dissertation, she kind of notes two major changes that the mall culture has brought with it. And here in that image, you see one of these strip malls in Alexandria, I think, which opened in 2003 or 2002. So the major changes, one of the major changes that it brought is that although the imperative of a mall is to consume and spend money, youth without money still hanged out there and loitered and spent time, which I did in that very space I'm showing here when I was, I think, 14 or 15. She notes that they become these spaces become one of the rare spaces to hang out that were accessible to a variety of youth and where the mingling of youth from different genders was possible. If these spaces showed anything, it didn't show that youth were longing to consume, even though maybe they were if they had the money, but they were rather longing for nice, clean spaces shaded by trees where they could hang out, have fun, and escape the constant harassment of security and moral authority, as it was the case in public spaces or even at university. So even spaces that were created for other reasons can be subverted and can be changed and used very differently. And this is not something that is typical of the region. It's something that is typical everywhere, that spaces are used for reasons that weren't the reasons they were created for. So you had kind of the internet, a virtual space, you had the malls, economic spaces that were used in a different way, but you had also in the 2000s the rise of a vivid independent music scene. And I want to kind of say a couple of words about that music scene. So it is important to understand that in most of the countries of the region, after decolonization in the mid 20th century, and I'm sure you heard of that before in the other webinars, the states were very controlled very much the economy, but also the culture and almost everything in the public space. So that means that cultural production was very centrally related to the state and the state's objectives. And although, for instance, in Egypt, it produced great pieces of art in the 50s, 60s, and onwards, it kind of changed by the end of the century. And in a sense, it became kind of very classicist, and it became, there wasn't a lot of new things happening in these spaces. And also, obviously, there was a lot of scrutiny from the security apparatuses in those spaces. But with that relative opening I mentioned in the 2000s, also with the economic liberalization, more and more spaces kind of started popping in different places popping up, where you had like new recording studios, new venues for artists, and so on and so forth. And you could see that in different places around the region, new concerts, but also new festivals were taking place. So for instance, in Morocco, in 1999, a music competition was created. Like, it was supposed to be a music competition for bands, and then it ended up becoming a full-fledged music festival that became, and still continues to be, a very important event in Moroccan and North African independent music, so-called El Boulevard. You can see the name right here. But also similarly, in Egypt, you had these types of festivals. For instance, in the mid 2000s, you had the SOS Music Festival that was organized, also to which I attended. And again, here you can see that relationship between economic liberalization and the emergence of small different initiatives, with the state kind of going back a little in the back. So in that case, for instance, what happened was that Marlboro, I think, or another major cigarette company was sponsoring the event to try to make some publicity and so on. So you had a big festival that drew thousands of youth in Cairo. And for me, it's really important to think of these spaces. And when thinking about the Arab uprisings, it is necessary to think about these rising number of other spaces where youth spent time together, thought differently about the world that was around them. And on the other hand, it is impossible to think of these spaces today without mentioning the importance of the Arab uprising events. And I just want to, I see I don't have a lot of time left, so I want to kind of I'm going to go quickly through those images. This is an initiative of some of those youth who used to hang out in the cultural spaces before the revolution, who after the revolution wanted to bring their art and culture to the street, and they created that street music mini mobile concert, which you can find online on YouTube. And what the idea was, they would go out in the street. These are pictures from downtown Alexandria, and organize kind of these improvised concerts for the general public. And here you can see a very kind of typical reaction to big revolutions or big political events where artists or avant-garde artists want to get closer to the people. This is why I think these spaces are important to look at. Um, and this also brings me that obviously these spaces do not, because they bring youth together, because they open up to different forms of different lifestyles, and also because they make visible things that used to be invisible, they also can easily bring harsh repercussions and repression on the hand of the state. So for instance, you have a major band, a Lebanese alternative rock band, which is called Mashrou Layla, who which its frontman is openly gay and is an activist about it, which is a very rare thing to see in that region. So when he played, because he is seen as an idol and as an icon for a lot of young homosexuals in the Middle East, when they were playing in Egypt, some of them were holding rainbow flags, and that kind of led to a repression and arrests in a lot of people in that community who were brought to prosecution. There were similarly banned or concerts were canceled in their home country of Lebanon for alleged blasphemy, and in Jordan were also banned a couple of times. So you have these kind of moral panics around them, and these are not new things. These moral panics are not something that are because of recent problems. You can see that I found those two excerpts, one from 1997 and one from 2003. Here is the New York Times and here is Reuters. One from Egypt, one from Morocco, and they both concern the arrests of Satanists. And in reality, these were not Satanists. These were just heavy metals fans who listened or played heavy metal. But you have these kind of moral panics that happen. And this shows you how there is a kind of strong relationship between kind of morality, the defense of morality, state security agencies, and even those other spaces, those artistic spaces. And that is not just about art, but there is always that scrutiny that is here. I don't have time to look at that point, and I want to get to my conclusion in the 4 remaining minutes I have. So from all of what I've tried to show, all the problems facing youth, all the kind of elongation of the state in which they are stranded between two states, right, between childhood and adulthood, and all the constraints, economic and other, that they face, how do some of their actions, how do some of their attitudes strive to unmake the system, subvert the rules in sometimes very strange way? And I want to here kind of note, and I chose a couple of words. When you read anthropologists working on these topics and sociologists working on these topics in the region, you have these kind of semantic family of words that always appear. Words like malal, boredom, faragh, vacuum, tufush, which can be translated as social despair, hugra, which can be translated as contempt or oppression, la mubala, indifference, and many other words. And these words come from very different contexts. Some of them are used in Morocco and Algeria, which is a very different dialect from Egypt or Saudi Arabia. And they all kind of highlight or underline a duality of feelings of alienation, of boredom, but also of some form of oppression and some form of despair. And some have argued, some anthropologists, that also this boredom, this indifference, can be seen as a form of depoliticization or apathy, but it also can be the prerequisite for action, and sometimes the most what might seem as irrational actions, but which need to be grounded in that experience of boredom, vacuum, social despair, and so on to understand them. One of the most famous ones of these, obviously, is that economic hardships and social and political exclusion are central to understand some figures as the Harraga. So the Harraga, literally those who burn their papers. So basically the youth who try to cross the Mediterranean to go to Europe and find a better life at the risk of dying, which has unfortunately become a very common thing in the Mediterranean. Or in that case, which you see what is called in the North Africa, the Hittist, which is literally might be translated as the wallists. So the people who just stand next to a wall like that and kind of have this boredom or just that feeling of alienation and being alienated that is conducive of different different actions, such as, for instance, crossing the Mediterranean. And I want to close with what might seem as an extreme form that has been analyzed very interestingly by my colleague and friend Pascal Menoret from the Crown Center, which is joyriding. And so basically the act of, for young people in Saudi Arabia who are fueled by boredom, anger, and alienation to steal cars and go racing down at terrifying speeds, as Menoret puts it, through Saudi Arabia's biggest cities. What I find very interesting in the works of Pascal Menoret, and on the left you have his book published in 2013 about joyriding, and his upcoming book, which will come out in a couple of weeks on Islamic activism and activism more generally in Saudi Arabia, is that it looks very specifically at how boredom, anger, alienation, indifference are very political sentiments that in the experience of youth, who feel completely alienated and do not have a sense of agency, they can unmake what has been made. So for instance, unmake the streets of Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, which has been made of economic development and political repression, unmake them through the acts of driving at crazy speeds in those streets, or by subverting the suburban life of Saudi Arabia into a hub for activism against the state. So in a sense, through these varieties of actions and of practices, these youth can again reclaim a feeling or a sense of agency that has been stripped from them over the decades, and made them feel that sense of loss or alienation or social despair, as I mentioned. So I hope I was able to make myself clear, and I'm very happy to take questions and try to expand on other words on other topics if you'd like. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic presentation. We do have questions. We do have questions that are starting to come in. There's a couple about the concept of other spaces or other places. You'd mentioned the internet earlier on in the presentation as creating this other space, but the nature of how people access the internet has changed drastically in the last 20 years or so. It's no longer necessarily a computer that is, stationary in the home or at an internet cafe. But with the advent of smartphones, it's something that is mobile and put in one's pocket. So how has the nature of the mobility of internet access changed the sorts of ways people engage? One would imagine that if it's not a computer in your living room where your family is also seated next to you, the content, the conversations would be different. If it's not at an internet cafe where you're paying, the amount of time spent on a phone, on the internet, might also change. I'm curious to know a little bit about that.
So yeah, that is a great question. Obviously, so I am of the generation who spent a lot of time in internet cafes, and obviously in internet cafes, you're either reading up on stuff or you're kind of playing on like network games. But it clearly has changed completely the way people use use the internet. And I think that a big difference between, for instance, my time as an adolescent using internet and now is that it is really mostly about social media today rather than the internet as it used to be before. So I think that with the development, I don't have the numbers, but I know that they are huge, at least for Egypt, of how many people have smartphones and have direct, like instantaneous access to internet. So I think that anything we might have said about the internet in the 2000s has grown bigger now with the new tools. But at the same time, the state has also now become much more aware of what happens on the internet and kind of has focused its gaze on it. And it has become, so a lot of websites are, for instance, how do you say, they are forbidden in Egypt, or at least they are removed from access. You cannot access them from Egypt. You have, it had been common at some point for, like, one of the first thing police officers might do when searching someone is to look at their social media feed in different countries. So there is this feeling that this is a space to be monitored. This is a space to be aware of, especially because of that discourse of the revolutions being something that is linked to the internet. And I think a very good example of that is how on January 28th, 2011, when the state started feeling that something was really going on and maybe it was actually a revolution, Egypt cut off all internet in all of the country, which had never been done. I think there was only one other case of that internet was completely shut down for the whole country, because there was a belief that if internet was not working, it might not go through. So I think, in a sense, it has become a more important tool. It has become an even more widely accessible and available tool for a lot of people. It has stopped being a youth tool. I think this is a big difference too. You have more and more, it has become more democratized, and more age groups use it than when I was younger. It was just something that was for the youth. And in the same time, it has kind of focused a lot of attention from the state that monitors it much more than it used to.
So you, in that response, you mentioned state intervention, monitoring, surveillance, and repression. I'm curious to know if, on the other side of, kind of the flip side of that, if some of these other spaces over time, rather than serving as an alternative to mosque or university or family life at the home, if some of these subversive forms of expression have actually been normalized and co-opted by those more mainstream spaces, are we seeing these alternatives actually then permeating universities or families' life in a way where they're becoming almost domesticated, or less of an alternative expression and more of a mainstream expression?
So I'd say yes. Probably it's probably the case. There is probably a trend in general in any kind of social phenomenon that you see, that you have a tendency to domestication and a tendency of alternative things or kind of underground things going mainstream. It is for sure the case if we look more closely at the music scene or the art scene that strives, and it is normal for artists to strive and become more mainstream to kind of make a life out of it. But I think there's something interesting in the case of the Middle East. Those other spaces, I mean, I'm not the only one as a researcher who kind of thinks that they have been important. I think there has been a really strong realization from even state agencies that maybe these spaces were the cause of some of the things that happened, and maybe they should have paid a better attention to what was going on. And I think the reaction to that has been really far bigger scrutiny on these spaces, and kind of a less the leniency that we might have seen in the 2000s has now tended to disappear regarding most of these spaces. So some of the spaces that I mentioned, some of the festivals and some of the initiatives now don't exist anymore, because the kind of political climate does not help have these activities still going on. So some of them might have become mainstream in a sense, but also I think that if we look at the situation today in many of these countries, it has less opportunities maybe than what used to be the case, obviously in the couple of years after the revolutions, but even before the revolutions. But then again, the thing is, spaces keep popping up everywhere. And although maybe those I know best kind of face hardships and have a hard time being visible, I am sure that users in other spaces are creating, different alternatives and different ways and different spaces to be together and do things together. So it's kind of an organic property of the of any society, right? You have even in settings where that are not conducive of collective action and of people doing things together, you still have things that emerge and spaces that might emerge and do so.
So another question, again, going back to a comment you had made about the nature of the internet and how it can expand the scope of who one can access and be in conversation with. It's no longer those who are in your more immediate temporal reality. While language might be a barrier, I'm curious to know if we move beyond the Arab world and think more broadly about Iran, Turkey, Israel, some of the other ethnic communities and nation states in a more encompassing definition of the Middle East, to what extent or in what ways has the internet brought populations in the Arab world into more conversation with their Iranian, Turkish, Hebrew speaking Israeli counterparts in the region? And what does that look like?
So this is a difficult question, right? This is also because these are not topics I have researched, so I would feel a bit uncomfortable. But what my feeling is that in a large sense, the internet is still, the early research on the internet would always kind of highlight the saying that birds of a feather flock together, right? I remember one of the early writings by a researcher on that, and that there is a tendency of people talking to, I mean, the more common thing is people finding on the internet others who think alike. So for instance, in my research, I would find a lot of cases of youth who, for instance, grew up in an Islamist household or went to a kind of a more religious school and were themselves not feeling very comfortable wanting to get out of that or having doubts about their their experience, would find other people in similar situations on the internet and start talking to them and feel less alone in that sense. It was more of that than people talking to people who were very different. I remember one of my interviewees, though, talking that he would enjoy, one of the things he would enjoy is that he would kind of get into arguments online with people about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and with what he characterized as Jews or Israelis in his conversation. But I don't think, I think it has kind of not brought people together, but clearly the internet kind of renders a lot of things visible that weren't visible. And because of the structure of the algorithms of spaces like Twitter or Facebook, you end up seeing certain things. So for instance, you end up following a bit more protests that are going on in Iran and identify with the youth of Iran in the sense as both facing these kind of old regimes that are autocratic and that are do not allow a lot of freedoms, or you you are going to feel a proximity to other countries or other youth that seem to be similar to you. But in a sense, it's not going to go beyond that experience of just watching the news and kind of following up what's going on. But again, I really want to stress the fact that this is kind of an educated guess in a sense. It's how I feel from what I can observe, but this is not something that I have researched personally, so it's always hard to say.
Well, one final question before asking for some book recommendations. Thinking about your research, and if we want to ground it in Egypt, that's great. I'm curious to know a little bit more about gendered experiences and kind of the intersection between gender, sexuality, and some of the spaces that came to the fore in your presentation, be it malls, the internet, or other spaces. Could you
So I'm
comment
glad
on?
you're asking that question. It's because it is a central question, and I kind of do it sometimes on purpose. That there is in social science in general, and when looking at the Middle East, kind of more particularly, there is an image is that when you talk about the social actor, or when you talk about an individual, it is kind of this average person who is usually a man. And when talking about a lot of experiences. In the Middle East, it is a lot of the time masculine experiences and experiences of young men because they constitute the majority of people who try to cross the Mediterranean, because they constitute the majority of people who end up, I don't know, becoming jihadis or activists, or who, for instance, do joyriding. So it is a central aspect, and any experience of youth is obviously a gendered experience of youth, as it is also mediated by class and sometimes race, which is not as a central aspect in the context of some Middle Eastern countries. But of course, it is a very gendered experience, and I think one of the very interesting things in the dissertation of Marika Snyder on the malls is how it relates very strongly to a gender dynamic. And I was mentioning that there were that she kind of saw two major things that were brought about by malls. One of them was the fact that these were spaces where people could just hang out, and these were new spaces, but also these were spaces of secure presence for women and for young women. So because they had private security firms, because there was some sort of how do you say, control that wasn't state control, these spaces were deemed as spaces that were safe for women to go to and to spend time in. So I think both for malls, but then even experiences as the internet and other places also had a very specific trajectory if you are a young woman or if you are a young man. Um, then basically most of what I have said, when you if you put a gender lens to it, you see how the variations related to the age of marriage, to the responsibilities of who buys what in a marriage, which is very codified in the region, the experience of a university, the experience of being able to express one's sexuality and live it in any ways, basically, is very different if you're a young man or a young woman. So there has been great research that has been done on these topics on Saudi Arabia and other places, and I would be happy to yeah, mention some of it if anyone wants.
Yeah, that would be a wonderful way to conclude. If you have some titles that may allow for us to continue our own adult learning, but also a title or two, if any come to mind, that may be student facing and appropriate to bring into classrooms for younger learners.
Mhm. So as I mentioned, I was mentioning my colleague Pascal Menoret, who has written a wonderful book called Joyriding in Riyadh, which is usually it is a book that works pretty well when teaching for undergrads at university, but I would imagine that it could at least parts of it. And I mean, he has written kind of shorter version. He has a version like an article length version in The Guardian that is found online that kind of helps explain why youth engage in joyriding and drifting in Riyadh. Then you have the works of Samuli Shilka, whom I mentioned, a Finnish anthropologist, who has written several very interesting articles and books on Egypt, on boredom and despair, on being a non-believer, on several issues that relate to the experience of youth in Egypt. And then, for instance, on Saudi Arabia, also you have a wonderful book by a researcher named Amélie Le Renard, a French researcher who has a book called The Society of Young Women, and who basically studies the experience of young women in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and kind of looks at these gender dynamics in a really interesting way. I mean, there is a variety of great research, even just looking at some of the postdocs that are currently at the Crown Center or who have been at the Crown Center in the past years. You'll find a lot of very interesting briefs on youth politics and youth engagement. You have my colleague and friend Yazan Duran, who published one on youth politics in Jordan, and my brief also. I will be publishing a brief on protest in the following weeks, so you can keep on the lookout for that. But yeah, I mean, there is in anthropology and sociology really a lot of great things that have been written those past years.
Wonderful. So on that note of those recommendations, I'd like to once more, on behalf of Primary Source, thank you for sharing your expertise and providing us with hopefully some new glimpses and insights into a part of the world that we're deeply invested in knowing more about. And you've offered us a new lens through which to gain access to the Middle East. So thank you again for sharing your time with us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me, and it was a pleasure, and I hope it was useful for everyone. And please write to me. You have my address on the last slide. If you want to have more questions or want to learn more, I have more references, I would be happy to respond to you.
All right, we'll make sure to follow up. Thank you.